Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us again today for a dataPARC webinar. My name is Aaron Mosier, and today I'm joined by a colleague, Sarah Sumner.
Hello, everyone.
So today we're going to go over, or mostly Sarah will go over, leveraging Power BI with dataPARC. So enhancing your data visualization for manufacturing. So first, a little bit of kind of housekeeping. Is if you have any questions, please type them in as the webinar goes. We'll sometimes be able to take a break in the middle and answer some, or we'll try to get to them at the end. If you have any audio problems, you might try dialing in instead of using your computer, or type in a question and let us know, your sound dropped off or you're losing us, and we'll try to adjust that as we go. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned, I'm Aaron Mosier, engineering manager at dataPARC. And then Sarah is a senior project engineer with dataPARC, and she'll be doing most of the talking for us today. Next slide.
Yeah.
Great. Now I'll hand it over to Sarah, and I'll be watching the questions as we go.
Thank you, Aaron. As you mentioned, my name is Sarah Sumner. I am a senior project engineer with dataPARC, and I've been with the company for about 9 years. I'm very excited to discuss how you can leverage Power BI to view your ParkView data. So we're going to be talking a little bit about ParkView and Power BI, what you can see in Power BI that also exists in your ParkView. Then we'll look at a use case demo that is on our Power BI viewer page. And then I'll do a live demonstration in Power BI desktop of how to query the ParkView database. I'll create a very simple alarm report for you. And then I'll also show how to query Park data and create a graph visual with that process information. And we'll have a little bit of time at the end for questions and answers. So what type of ParkView data can you see within Power BI? The most common is your SQL data. So that is things like NDEs, alarm events, alarm evidence, run statistics. But you can also use Park data to view process data. You can view your Park history tags, you can view your third-party tags, anything that is a tag within ParkView, you can then pull in using Park data. And if you're familiar with our Excel add-in, you can also connect Power BI to Excel and pull information from a data normalize sheet or from Function Painter. So let's take a look at a couple of examples that people are using Power BI. So they're looking at things like downtime reporting and drill down, and that's the demo that I'm going to show you today. They're also doing high process overviews. I have on the screen here an example of a waste stream analysis where they're digging into what is causing this high amount of waste losses. And they're also doing crew comparison charts. So these are just some of the examples, kind of get your brain going about what's possible within Power BI using ParkView data. So let's hop into the demo. Most of the webinar today is going to be this demo. So here is a desktop view as well as the mobile view of a little downtime tracker or alarm event viewer that I've built in Power BI. So I can look at it inside of a web browser and navigate and play around with it, or I can look at it on my mobile phone. So let's take a look at that website view. And I'm going to open up my workspace. And we just have the free version of Power BI. So this is something that you could set up on your system for free and play around with yourself. I do not have access to give other people the ability to play around with this. So what I'm looking at currently is an alarm event viewer, and I have broken out my various alarm events between May 10th and June 9th by process area and then by month as well. So I've got my different filters up at the top, my different slicers, and then I've got a table underneath where I can look at my different events. And I have Pareto charts underneath that where I can look at my alarm event count by process area and month, and I can look at my alarm duration by process area and month. When I click on one of my events, it focuses on that inside of my charts. So I can zoom in here. I'm using a zoom slider, and I can see that one event for paper machine 2 that occurred in May. And when I click back onto that event, I'm able to see the rest of my events inside of my Pareto. As I mentioned, I've got filters up at the top, and these are actually slicer visuals. So I could say I'm interested in seeing all my events that have evidence. So within ParkView, whenever you have an alarm event, you can assign evidence tags or evidence values to that alarm event, and those values are then tied to that event. So I can run reports on them, I can see them in the future, and I can do Pareto charts on that evidence. And what I've done here is I've tied that evidence to what's called a drill through, and I can drill through to a different view and see Park data trends of each one of my evidence tags. So I've got my different evidence descriptions listed, the value mode, so this is what is being stored within ParkView. For my craft silo, it's the start tank level, and then I can see the value. And when I click on each of these, my Park data trend changes and shows me all of my data for the duration of my alarm. So if I go back, I'm able to see what alarms have that evidence assigned to them and which ones maybe don't have evidence. I can also create slicers based off of those reason codes, so I can drill down into my different reason codes. So I could say I'm only interested in things that happen on the dry end of my paper machine. Very, very similar to our Pareto charts. Or maybe I'm only interested in that dryer blow through event. Now I can see that dryer blow through event. It doesn't seem to have any evidence, so I'm unable to go into my drill through. So I can make very intuitive, very user-friendly visuals and displays within Power BI for my end users that maybe is a little bit more intuitive than something that they would see inside of ParkView. I can also combine this with maybe accounting information that's coming out of SAP or other systems that aren't already within ParkView. So let's take a look at how I went about building this particular display in Power BI. So I'm going to open up Power BI Desktop. This is a program that I have installed on my computer. It's not a web interface. And this is where I design those visuals. So most of our connections to ParkView are going to be from my SQL Server. So I'm going to create a SQL Server database. And my server is RLP S Sumner, it's my computer. And then my database is my training database. I've got two options for connectivity. I can either import or I can direct query. If I do an import, then all of the data is going to be saved as a data set, and that is going to be in that Power BI cloud as well when people need to access a Power BI display. The data never updates once I've imported it. I can manipulate it as much as I want, but it doesn't refresh from the database. A direct query is supposed to refresh, but you need a gateway license in order to do that. I didn't have a gateway license, so I'm going to show you the import method. So I'm going to click OK. And then I need to choose what views, tables, functions, stored procedures I want to bring into my Power BI display. So I'm interested in the alarm event details. I'm going to build that alarm event report again. And it gives me a little preview of what I'm going to be importing. I go ahead and click load, and it brings that in as a data set. There we go. So I've got my data set here on the right side of my screen, and I can start building my visuals. So the first visual I'm going to add is that table. I'm going to drag it to about the middle of my screen here and extend it out so it's the full width of my display page. And the columns that I want to add are going to be my name, which is that process area. So I'm going to rename this guy to process area. I want to grab my tag name. So I drag that into my columns, and we'll go ahead and rename this to tag name. I want to grab my start event, but when I drag in my start event, it gives me the hierarchical view that includes the year, quarter, month, day. I just want the date. So I'm going to select start event, and now I just have the date there. We'll rename this to start event so it's nice and pretty. And I do the same thing for my end event. Go ahead and rename that. And then for my reason code, I want what is called the full reason. And that is going to include that colon that separates my reason code into the different areas. We'll rename this to reason code. And then I want to be able to see any comments that my operators have put in as well. So I'm going to bring in comments. And then just for consistency, I'm going to capitalize it. There we go. And then I can resize my different fields so that I can see everything and read it all well. So I can scroll through here. I can see that I have a whole bunch of events that I can look through, maybe do a little bit more resizing so that things look as pretty as possible. But I've got my very first visual. Then if I want to add those Paretos down at the bottom, I'm going to select a stacked column chart and drag that down. And we're going to make this half the size. Oh, I accidentally expanded my filters. There we go. About half the size of my display window. And for my Pareto chart, I want to be looking at my process areas as my x-axis. And my y-axis, I want the count of my start events. So I'm going to drag my start events into the y-axis, and it will give me a count. Alternatively, I could also grab my alarm event ID, and I would just change this from being a sum to a count. Either one will work. So this is giving me a count of alarm events by process area, but I also want to look at it on a month-to-month basis. So to do that, I go to my start event and I grab my month from the date hierarchy and put that in the legend. So now I've got my stacked columns by month. My x-axis is my process areas, and then I have a count of my alarm events here in my y-axis. Now let's make this pretty. So I'm going to go into my visual formatting, and I'm going to change that x-axis so that my title is now process area. I'm going to change my y-axis title so it reads count of alarm events. I'm going to add a zoom slider, so that allows me to zoom in, particularly on May, where I don't have as many events for my different process areas. And I'm going to add data labels too, so that I can see exactly what the values are just within my visual. When I go into general, I can change my title. So I'm going to call this alarm event count by process area and month. There we go. So I have my first Pareto chart already made. I copy and paste that, bring it over, and we're going to make this one duration. But as I look through my data set, I don't have a column that is duration. So I need to create that. So I'm going to go into my model view, theoretically. There we go. So I go into my model view, and I'm going to edit the query that is pulling in my alarm event data. So I'm going to create a brand new column. So I go to Add Column, and I'm going to create a custom column. And my custom column is going to be my end event minus my start event. Okay, so I've created this custom column, and it is calculating the difference, the time difference between my start event and my end event. And I want this to be in a particular format. So I'm going to change the formatting of this column, and I'm going to transform it into minutes. So now this is just reporting the minutes for my alarm event. So I go ahead, close and apply it. And I'm going to head back to my report view. Alternatively, you could do date diff and calculate it that way. But now I can go to my visualization, and I can find that column, which is just currently called custom. And instead of a count of my alarm events, I'm going to grab in that custom column. There we go. So now I have a sum of my events. I'm going to do the same thing that I did on my other chart. I'm going to change my x-axis so that it still says process area. I'm going to change that y-axis so that my title is alarm duration. And I'm going to change my title to alarm event duration by process area and month. So when I click, it automatically starts filtering out my different Paretos down at the bottom. When I click on my event again, they come back. But I need some additional slicers so that I can filter out my data more efficiently than just trying to find an event in my list and filtering it out that way. So I'm going to add a slicer up at the top, and let's resize this. And the first slicer I'm going to add is on that process area. So I'm going to grab my name field again and drag and drop it in. I'd apparently clicked off of my visual. There we go. So now I've got a handy little slicer where I could say I'm only interested in boiler events, or I'm only interested in plant events. And I can change the way this looks. I have a couple of different style options. I tend to like that tile option. And I'm going to rename my field so that it is process area. And then maybe I want a start and an end date slicer as well. I'm just going to copy this over and then swap out that field for my start event. Now my tiles, those don't really make sense in my slicer settings. So I'm going to change this to a between, and that gives me my start and end calendar, and it also gives me a slider that I can use to modify those values. I'm going to rename my field again to start event, and just copy this over and swap it out with my end event. Rename my field and change my slicer settings. There we go. Now the next slicer that I want to add is on the reason code. But if I just add a slicer on my full reason field, I get the list of all of the reason codes that have been assigned. And I want this more to be a tree view. But I don't have that option in my slicer settings. I can do a vertical list, a tile, or a dropdown. I don't have an option to make it look like a tree. So I need to build that myself. So I'm going to go back into my edit query. And I'm going to copy that full reason field. I have to find it. There it is. So I've got my full reason field here, and I want to display the full reason on my table, but I want it broken out inside of my slicer. So to do that, I'm going to copy and duplicate my entire full reason column. So now I've got a copy here, and I'm going to rename that to reason code. So once I have that copied, I can now manipulate this reason code column and break it into its separate reason codes. So I can build a hierarchy. So I'm going to go to transform, and I'm going to split that column. And I'm going to split it on a delimiter. So our delimiter is a custom delimiter, and it is space colon space. And that is how we break out our reason codes. Now I do have some advanced options. I can tell it how many columns I want it to split into. So I know that my reason code tree or my downtime tree is 3 levels deep. So I'm going to split this into 3 columns. I click OK, and now I've got reason code column 1, reason code column 2, and reason code column 3. And I still have my full reason that I can use for my table. So I'm going to close and apply those settings. And then I'm going to alter my splitter or splicer, field. So it's no longer full reason. Instead, I'm using reason code 1, followed by reason code 2, and then reason code 3. So now when I expand these, I'm able to see all 3 levels within my slicer. And this needs a bit of a rename too. I'm going to rename this slicer header. Instead of saying reason code 1, 2, and 3, I'm just going to call it reason code. So now I've created a very quick version of that alarm event viewer that I can navigate. I can give it to maybe other engineers. I can give it to people who are higher in my organization, and they'll be able to navigate and see this alarm event data without having to have ParkView installed on their computer. And they'll be able to see it against things like accounting information and other visuals that you've created for your organization. All right. I'm going to pause for a second. Have there been any questions while I've been giving this demonstration?
Actually, the only questions we've had, and I sent a reply to all, was just people asking if they're going to be able to look at this presentation later for a postal recording of it. And I think it's because you move so quickly and fairly seamlessly that people are like, I think I can do this, but I'll pause a lot. So yeah, for everybody else, we do post all our webinars on our forum. We sometimes attach the PowerPoints too. And it's also a great place to ask more questions or have discussions. So we will send out to the registry's list everybody that have registered when that's posted up and available. And all our webinars are on the forum if you want to go back and look at the history of them.
Yeah, thank you, Erin.
And then, okay, we do have a question that came in of somebody asked, could you expand how ParkView is not necessary to have ParkView tags? Oh, expand how ParkView is not necessary to have the ParkView tags available in Power BI. So expand on how somebody that doesn't have ParkView installed on their box could still look at the Power BI displays.
Yep, so that's a great question, and that's actually the next part of the demo, is how do you pull in process data into Power BI when maybe you don't have ParkView available on your computer?
Perfect.
So I'm going to create a new display to play with within my Power BI, and I'm going to add some Park data into my display. So I'm going to create another SQL Server connection. And once again, this is just my local computer in this instance and my training system. I'm using import, but for Park data, you're probably going to want to use that direct query so that the data will refresh if you are trying to look at real-time data in particular. So I'm going to hit OK and go and find my Park data functions. So those are all function types. It will have FN in that name. And I often like to use this read interpolated tags. I don't necessarily want raw data, particularly for something that is a sensor or instrumentation that is writing out every second or every 3 seconds. I want to use interpolated data so that I'm not returning such a large quantity of information into Power BI. I want to kind of limit that data set a little bit so I'm not returning millions of rows. So I'm going to use this read interpolated tags, and it tells me I need several parameters filled in order to use this function. So I need a UTag list, start date, end date, aggregate, step size, and separator. So my UTag list, I'm going to open up my ParkView and go to my tag browser. I'm going to generate a list off of my tags. And I'm just going to drag and drop some tags into a notepad and then create a semicolon separated list. And the reason I'm using semicolons instead of commas is because there are some countries where a comma is used in place of a decimal. And so it's a little bit easier to differentiate when you use a semicolon. So I've created my UTag list. I'm just going to paste it directly into Power BI. I'm going to give it a start date. So we'll say the beginning of this month to maybe we'll just do a single week. For my aggregate, I want to see a time average. Since this is process data, which is time series, I can do a time average on it. I want to see 1 minute data, and then my separator in that UTag list is a semicolon. I can hit apply, and it loads that data in from my Park data service. And I can now see all of those values at 1 minute intervals for my tags. And this is just a little preview, it's not all of the data. But if I'm happy with what has been returned, I can hit load. And it will save that data set. So it says I have pending changes to my queries. It's loading all that data into the model. And if I go and take a look at my model view, I now have a brand new data set that I can work with from Park data. All right, so I want to add in a list of all the tags that I pulled into Power BI using that Park data function. So I'm going to create a table visual and expand my Park data function dataset. So I'm interested in the tag name, and I can either drag it into my table here, or I can drag it into columns. And now I've got a list of those tags. I'm going to rename this so it's a little bit prettier. So just put in tag name. And then I want a line chart if I'm going to build something to look similar to a trend. So we'll make this nice and big to work with. My x-axis is going to be my timestamps. And once again, I want this, instead of the date hierarchy, to just be the timestamp value. And my y-axis is going to be my tag value. Now this is going to be a sum at each data point of all of the tags, but I want to be able to look at tags individually. It doesn't make sense for me to be creating a sum of these 4 tags, since it includes things like my controller output, my process values, my set points. So I need to add in the tag name to my legend. And that is going to break that data up so that each data point is just the value at that timestamp. So now I can do things like make or rename my titles. I can rename my x-axis and my y-axis so that they're a little bit nicer to look at. So I'm going to rename my x-axis to timestamp and have it capitalized. Rename my y-axis to tag value, and then rename my title to Park Data Trend. When I click on my tag name, it focuses on that tag and just shows me the data for that particular tag. Now, because I am using an imported data set, my data set is never going to update. I am using a static start and end time and a static data set. So this is not a real-time view of my data. This is never going to update, but it is a historical view of a specified start and end date, a specified time span. So that's something to keep in mind as you're playing around with this, but it's also what makes it a great use for that evidence view, where I already have defined start and end times based off my event start and end time for my alarms. Now, if you're using a direct query and you have the licensing for a gateway, you should be able to set up a real-time query for your park data. If I wanted to pull in more information, maybe the tag name isn't sufficient, maybe I also need descriptions, I can bring in my process tags data set so that I can see things like the description, the units, and I have an example somewhat of that within my evidence view here with my drill through, where I'm showing my evidence description. And then if you look in my park data description, it includes that evidence, my units, and then the tag name. All right, so we've taken a look at how I can integrate park data, park SQL data, such as my alarm events, into Power BI, and how I can bring process values into Power BI. But what are some alternatives if maybe you don't have Power BI yet? Maybe it's something that you are advocating for your site, but you haven't achieved that yet. You can also use Excel. Excel has the ability to do slicers and filters in a very similar manner to Power BI. You can bring in the same data sets into Power BI that you can bring into Excel. And you can make incredibly similar visuals to what you can build in Power BI. So here's an example of that same downtime report, that alarm event viewer where I have the same slicers based off of, in this case, year, process area, reason code, and then I've got my Paretos and my table underneath it. You can also use PARC View graphics and PARC reports. So here is a process area overview, Paper Machine 2 dashboard that was built in PARC View graphics. And then we have PARC Mobile. So if you are really interested in the mobile aspect of Power BI, where I can see those visuals on my phone, you can do something very similar with PARC Mobile, where you build the graphic, you build trends inside of PARC View, and then those are accessible through a web browser on your mobile device. So those are some alternatives to Power BI if maybe you don't have Power BI available at your site yet. All right.
Okay.
So, oh, go ahead, Aaron.
I was going to say we do have a couple more questions.
Great.
Um,
Okay.
So one of them, again, and I think you expand on it, it is expanding on, as I mentioned, how ParkView is not necessary to be installed on a PC for the tags to be able to get data in Power BI. And that's basically because Power BI is connected to or more SQL and the data sets than having the need for ParkView components.
Yep, that's correct.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So another one came in is can you combine data from multiple SQL databases in one Power BI display?
Yes, you can. So I could create a new connection here, a new data set. This is still on my same computer, but I can talk to a different database. So I'm going to connect this to just my regular config database. And then I have a whole new connection that I can query and pull in as a data set into my Power BI. So now I'm talking to a separate database than the one I was using for my initial demo. So if you have databases all over the place, you have a LIMS system that's separate from your ParkView system, that's separate from your accounting system, that's separate from your quality control, you can pull all of those databases at what it's something we commonly see, right? You
Yeah.
can pull all of those databases and all of that information into a single Power BI visual or a single Power BI display using these different data sets. If you're using that import mode, it creates the data set and then saves that up into the cloud. So you don't have a continuous connection into those systems if you're worried about some kind of security in that sense.
That makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Another question was just about was about Park data and Park data licensing and what that is. And I think we do have a webinar, if I'm remembering correctly, that we did go over the use of Park data. But basically, you can think of it correctly, right? It's a service that runs on the dataPARC server that allows you to directly communicate to SQL, run SQL queries. That service reaches out and reads the data, however it's configured in ParkView. It's just kind of giving us a SQL interface to all the data you could trend in ParkView.
Yeah, that's a good way of thinking of it. So I actually pulled up Park data, so it's running on my desktop instead of as a service. And mine is running locally. Oftentimes it'll be running on your ParkView server instead of running like on your SQL server, what have you, or running on your client. And this service is communicating through what's called a CLR to the SQL server. When you ask for data from Park server or a Park data server, it goes to SQL as a query. That query then goes to Park data. Park data pulls the information out of your UA, and then it gets returned back into SQL. And in this case, Power BI is what is doing that SQL query. So if I go to my data sets and I refresh those, When it refreshes, I can see that request come through in my Park data server, and I can see how long that took to return, in this case about 2 seconds, and how many values it returned. So it returned 40,000 values on 4 tags. So this service, Park Data Server, is part of your Park server licensing. So when you buy ParkView and have it licensed for your facility, this is part of that Park server applications licensing that you have. So we can configure this for your site if it isn't already set up, and you won't have to pay anything additional for Park Data Server. If you don't already have a Power BI license, because that is a Microsoft product, you would need to purchase the licensing from Microsoft for the Power BI.
Great. Oh, and just as a note too, is like Sarah said, this no additional licensing for Park data. It would be included. So another one is somebody just wanted to remind everybody that even with the free version of Power BI, you have the ability to export pages to PDF for distribution and reporting.
Yeah, that's a great note. Thank you for mentioning that. You can export this. I just have to remember where it is, because it's been a little while since I had to export it. Oh,
On the
it's in
far
here
left
somewhere.
side, there's an export, Sarah.
Oh, thank you. I'm so
Oh, there
used to looking to the right because of other web pages
know.
that we use that are similar. So I can export this to PDF. I'm choosing to exclude any hidden reports, so that would include that evidence view. And I can export either with current values, so that includes my slicer filtering, or I can use the default values, which would be my full data set. When I export, it generates that PDF for me. And you can set up subscriptions to this as well. So you could get a PDF report at 7 a.m. every morning. It does take a little bit to process.
So while that's running, I can go on to the next question. Oh, there we go.
There we go. So this is what my PDF looks like. It's very similar to a screenshot of my display. So I don't have the ability to expand my table at all. I can't really scroll up and down. It's just basically a screenshot of what I had on my display. So that's something to keep in mind. If you're hoping to have this expanded, it doesn't do that automatically.
So if you built your Power BI display to contain all the information in one unscrolled view, then you would get kind of the image you would want. Just
Correct.
kind of have to build it
Yeah.
to not.
You can also put this into what's called focus mode. So this does have it more expanded. I haven't played around with what it looks like when you send it to PDF, but if you analyze it in Excel, it includes all the information.
So somebody had a question, how did we pull the event data in Excel to make the graphic?
Yep, so that you've got a couple of different options. You can use actually a data normalized sheet to pull that information. You would set it to the alarm event option instead of, I think it's the time series option or something like that. And then you can pull in that alarm event data using data normalize. If you are familiar with VBA macros, you could build a custom VBA macro where you'd have a button that you click and it'll go out and pull that information for you. And then Excel has recently introduced the same dataset functionality that you see in Power BI, where you can import data out of a SQL server and you could pull it in that way. Yeah. So you have three different options there.
And if you're interested in more about the Excel add-in one, I think 1 or 2 webinars ago, we just did one. It was, I think, data normalized sheet and beyond or something like that, where we went over how to use the data normalized sheet to get alarm event data, roll-up data, and other things like that. Somebody else had a question about expanding on the query of interpolated tags, what type of aggregate types we have with Park data. And in basically the list is any of the ones that you would see in the Excel add-in or Centerline. So time average, standard deviation, min, max, etc. And we do have a document on how those queries look and work. That's part of Park data, and they list the long list of available aggregates too.
Yep. So
So
if you're familiar with our community forum,
yes.
we've got our latest manual there, and you can just search for Park data. And I'm looking at the read interpolated tags SQL query example, and it has a list of all the different aggregate types.
Perfect. Yeah. Another one was more of a comment somebody had that they have used, Power BI and dataPARC together before, and they have made additional views within the CTC config database to make it easier to point Power BI at dataPARC. So by combining some tables or even combining views, you can get a more user-friendly view of some of the SQL data by making more views.
Yeah, and that's a really great way for a SQL administrator to make it easy for someone who maybe doesn't have as much experience in SQL or who you don't want to give full database access to. You don't necessarily want them monkeying around and building their own stored procedures and views in your database. It's a great way to help them access the data in a way that they can understand within Power BI without opening up your SQL database to just anybody that wants to build a view.
Yeah, because you can restrict the access to the whole database and just open up a read-only view of the view.
Mm-hmm.
And then, yeah, and the last question we just had is Park data installed and enabled by default when installing in ParkView? And the answer to that is yes, it should be, but please reach out to our support group if you need any assistance in using it for the first time or making sure it's set up. But by default, it should be there and it should be installed and running. So
Yep,
the next thing would be a SQL connection. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep, the engineering department installs Park data and configures it. We will often ask your site at ParkView administrator and your IT department if they would like us to turn on this Park data service. And so some sites will say, nah, I don't think we're going to use that. Let's just leave it off. So it may not be turned on in your server, but it's probably been installed and configured.
Yes. Yes. So somebody wanted a little more expanse, and they saw where you made the separate connection to a different database, but they wanted to see the step on how you would use that second connection in the same report or view.
Oh, okay. So it's very similar to how I have two data sets here. These are talking to the same database, but I could very easily create a connection to another database. Let's see if I can think of one.
You could just hit the GDS one or the security one.
Yeah, that's true.
Not useful information in there, but
But there is stuff in there.
yes,
So I
it is
can
a
grab,
database.
it is a database. Mine appears to be fairly empty though. Yeah. Let's try grabbing the security one instead.
Yeah.
There we go. So I'm just grabbing the application table. When I hit load, it's going to load it as a data set, and then it just appears as a data set in my list. So when I go to build or add another visual into an existing display, let's say I want to add a table, I can grab any of the information that is inside of that other data set and populate that table. Now, when I click on it, there's no corresponding information in my other visuals. They're not tied in any way to this application data set, so I don't have that same kind of filtering. If I had data that was in some way connected, I could actually build a relationship between the columns so that then my filtering would work when I was clicking around this application name. It would then highlight the values in my other visuals. Similar to how when I click here, it highlights it in my alarm events.
Okay, so like if you had a database that contained like all your orders, and then you had another system that maybe had, or again, we use Park data to bring in the order ID tag or something, and then you could tie those together. So you could pick an order and actually maybe go get the data or get alarms or get roll-ups for that same period of time.
Exactly. And there's a couple of different ways I can deal with those relationships. One is I can just manage the relationships. Another way is I can transform the data and create a merge between my data sets. So if I go into Edit Query and I want to merge my queries together, I can combine them into a new query that is a brand new data set. So it doesn't really make sense to do this, but I'm going to use this read interpolated tables or my interpolated data. And I'm going to do a join on my U tag. And I can choose my type of join. So I'm going to do a full outer because I don't think I have any data that is both. So this is going to create a brand new data set that has merged those two tables together. So now if I scroll over, I should have a whole bunch of null for my park data. And I can choose which columns I want to expand, or I can aggregate them. I'm just going to select all of them. So now I've got all of the values from park data, and then I have all of the values from my alarm server. When I apply my changes, it will create that brand new data set that I can then use. There we go. So now I've got a data set all the way over here. I'm just going to move that. And it's connected that merge to my alarm event detail. And if I wanted to, I could then also manage a relationship and add a new relationship between my merge on my process data over here and my read interpolated data on that tag name. So now I've created a secondary relationship to my park data.
Great. I think we have time for one more question. Hopefully this one won't be too hard. Somebody's asking for you to expand on the direct query and how you could have reports auto update. So if you always wanted the report to be the last 7 days, how would you make things dynamic?
Yeah, so I haven't experimented a whole lot with that direct query because, like I said, we don't have a gateway. That's what refreshes that data. from what I have read in the Power BI help manual, it sounds like you would set an interval that that data would refresh, and the gateway actually goes out and reloads the data into the data set. So if I take a look at my user interface, my Power BI website, and I go to my workspace, I have not only a report, but I also have the corresponding data set, and this is what is being refreshed. So I can see information about that data set and where that data set is being used.
Okay, so if we had the gateway, this could be set to refresh daily, and then you could have your month of data rolling refresh.
Yep.
Okay. Great.
That's what I've gleaned from the Power BI documentation.
Yeah. Well, and like you said at the beginning, this is very interesting that this can all happen with just the free available version of Power BI. So, of course, there has to be a few things they want you to commit to a little more before you can make it possible.
Well, and I don't have, in the free version, you can't share this with someone else. So I couldn't share this. I couldn't say, I want to save this and send a copy to someone else because it is the free version. I'm limited to just my workspace and only I can see my workspace. So that's something to keep in mind as well.
Okay, so that would also be, somebody just asked about security. Need a little bit more for you be able to manage security and who you give access to. Because right now only you have access.
Only
So
I have
secure.
access. Yes.
Okay, if there are any questions that trickle in, we do have them and we do have your emails and we'll reply back to you, or we'll go on the forum and kick off the discussion by posting a question and answering it there. But again, thank you everybody from joining. Sarah, thank you for taking your time to show this today. I hope it was useful for everybody. And from all of us, we will talk to you next time.
Yep. Talk to y'all later, everyone. Bye.
Bye.